welcome back to my channel. In today's video, it's going to be my mental health story. So it's going to go from the past to the present, and it all started when I was 4. I had way too much energy as a kid that it just was not normal. Like, I know all kids do have lots of energy, but this was way too much. I was running and playing all the time. So my mum had decided to put me into gymnastics, and I was super flexible, so that's why my mum wanted me to go into gymnastics and not say netball or something. And then I turned 5 and I was still at gymnastics 3 times a week, and at this time I was doing competitive gymnastics, so we would do 3 competitions a year, which would be team competition, it would be judges invitational, and then states. And I was at the chiropractor pretty much every week because I put my back out. And when I say I put my back out, my muscles would slightly move a bit so that it would be very uncomfortable and I'd be in a lot of pain. And so I would have to get this little clicker done onto my back, which would move the muscles back into the place where they're supposed to be. Then when I was 6, I was always injured. If it was a wrist, if it was a knee, if it was an elbow, shoulder, back, it was something. And I was called a hypochondriac, I was called like attention seeking, but it wasn't true. And now after we figured out that I do have connective tissue issues, that it makes a lot of sense. So also at the age of 6, my coach, well, it wasn't my coach exactly, it was the head of the gym, told me I was getting fat and I needed to watch carbs, watch what I was eating. So I then cut bread and cheese and a lot of other foods out of my diet because I was so scared that I wasn't good enough. So I just tried to make a difference. And I refused to eat bread for about 4 or 5 years. It was a long time. Then I had my first major injury, and I had done a front salt. So like I was running and then I did a front salt, landed, and we thought I just jarred my knee, but I actually had torn all the ligaments, but one of the smallest ones. And then I was told I had to take about 6 to 12 months off, which I was very bummed about. And then when I came back, my coach didn't believe me because my injuries were too consistent, and then I would always overwork my knee, which I still sometimes have knee problems from the ligaments, but nothing I can't handle. And so my coach would say, then how can you do this and you can't do this? And I always felt horrible because I felt like I let her down. And at this time, I didn't like this coach. She was really rude to me, and it wasn't very kind to put that much pressure on a 7-year-old. Then when I was 8 and a half, I took some time off of sports completely as my injuries were way too consistent. I would always be hurt, and we needed to try and find a different energetic sport for me instead of gymnastics. So I then went to trampolining. And I also had this huge traumatic incident happen when I was about 8 and a half. This man had taken everything away from me. He just wasn't very, he tricked me. He full on manipulated me, but I can get into that story into another video, but not today because it's going to be my whole story. Then I also had my first suicidal thought. I didn't know what suicide was at this time. I just know I didn't want to be alive because I wasn't happy, but I didn't say anything because my parents were so focused on my older sister. Then when I turned 9, I had started trampolining. I was doing that competitively and I loved it. I had this amazing coach who meant the world to me. And then I still hadn't told anyone, but my mental health was slowly getting worse. I then was reading food labels and I was just looking at everything. I didn't know what calories were. I just was looking for carbs, fats and sugars. Then I turned 10 and I went to nationals all by myself. So my mum and my dad, none of them came. But I got to see my big brother from Sydney. He lives in Sydney. But that's a bit beside the point. I was the under 11s state champion. In both double mini and trampolining. Then I was also doing way too much core work. So I was over exercising, but nobody knew about that at that time. I then turned 11 and this is where I started to get help. I just told my mum I was really stressed and I then went and saw my school psychologist. I was either in year 5 or year 6, I don't remember, but she only focused on my sister. She didn't focus on me and my issues. It was just all about her, so I wasn't getting the help that I needed. I was still having suicidal thoughts and I had my first self-harm incident. This is pretty dumb, this little self-harm thing, but I had picked my skin to try and get to my vein, I guess. Not in the intent to kill myself, but it just... Then I started to restrict my eating at the age of 12. I had just... One day I just decided I'm not going to eat, and I didn't eat for 3 days. I was barely drinking and I passed out at school. I then had to quit trampolining because I had too much anxiety because I had broken my ankle 4 times in about the span of 2 years. One time I just come back from breaking an ankle and then I did my other ankle the next week. So I then got so scared and was filled with anxiety that I wouldn't do any of my big moves and I couldn't go any further. I then discovered what calories were. So I would be looking and calculating all the calories at the age of 13. And I discovered laxatives. So I would be abusing laxatives, taking 15 at a time, and I would be purging. So purging is where you intentionally make yourself throw up. Then also at the age of 13 my shoulders would dislocate. We didn't know that they were actually dislocating, we just thought they were just muscular pain. And then I became underweight. It wasn't majorly underweight because it was about 2-3 weeks before I went to Bali. My BMI before we went to Bali was about 18.2. So 18.5 is classified a healthy BMI and upwards. But I was classified underweight and then I went to Bali and put on 8 kilos and then I was like, you know what, stuff this, I'm not going to restrict my eating anymore. And then after a couple months, after gaining about 15 kilos, I felt disgusting and I started to restrict my eating yet again. I would then be binging and purging at least 4 times a week. I then would have this little exercise. I then would go I would leave the house at about 4:30 and get back at 7:30. I would walk down to my local park. I would do some exercise. So I'd run. I then would run and I would purge. Even if I had nothing in my system, I would still try and purge. And then I would self-harm. So at this point, I started to cut myself because I just needed to get some sort of pain out because I had no one to talk to at this time. Yes, I had friends, but none of my friends knew about my mental health. I then broke my ankle falling down the stairs. And Claire, who's right behind the camera, was there when it happened. And
Idiot trying to race me down the stairs.
it was funny, but right then I knew I'd broken my ankle. I was like, oh crap, my ankle's broken again. And I messaged my mum straight away. And yeah, turns out I had chipped my ankle. Then I started to I then had my first inpatient hospital admission. Okay, so I had my first inpatient admission in July when I was in year 8, and I'd go in every 3 weeks. Not intentionally, it just would happen. And at this time, I was struggling with my eating a lot, and then I had this really bad incident with another person who had an eating disorder there, which that just made everything worse. But I've had 7 admissions in total. But my 3rd admission, after that, I thought I was a fake because I'd never actually tried to kill myself. And I then ended up having my first suicide attempt at the age of 14. I had taken I'd only taken 8 tablets because that was all I could find, and I thought that was going to kill me. But again, little old me just doesn't know what she's on about. It wasn't going to. Then my self-harm started getting worse. I started having to have stitches. It just kept getting worse. Hospital made me 10 times worse. At the age of 14, I went to CAMHS, which is a mental health service. I know they've got them in other places of the world, but it stands for Child and Adolescent Mental Health Services. And I didn't like my worker, but that is where I fully disclosed what had happened. I didn't like my worker. She just chatted too much. She was older. I don't really get along with older people. So I then stopped going to CAMHS. I had gone to a private psychiatrist for about 6 months, and I got all my medications in order, and it was just so much better. I then hadn't been in a hospital for a couple months, which was big for me because every 3 months I'd end up back in. And then, so I went to this private psychiatrist. My meds they had helped me so much. I wouldn't be who I am today without my medication because I was so filled with anger that the littlest thing could set me off, and I would scream and yell and bash on walls, bash on doors. It wasn't a healthy environment for anyone to be in. I then, at the age of 15, I was sort of going uphill as I started this intensive therapy program called Touchstone. Touchstone is a 6-month program where you go 3 days a week for pretty much like a whole school day. You have individual therapy, family therapy, group therapy, OT, animation, and you still do school. I then had slipped up with my self-harm after being a few months clean because I had overeaten that day, and that was kind of the only ways I would self-harm at this time was if I had overeaten, if I was so out of control. but I then got stitches. I had gone back to Touchstone, and it was just, I got myself back on track. So in the little 2-week period from the introduction group to the full intensive program, I had ended up in hospital. That was my last hospital admission that I'd had. And it wasn't very healthy because I'd had a really traumatic hospital admission, the one before that one. And I was then labelled as this intensive girl. I would be locked in MECA, which was called the Mental Health Intensive Care Area, where they can lock you in this area so you can't hurt yourself or others, and you're very highly monitored. But it wasn't healthy, because then I went to this other hospital admission and I was just put back into that. I was locked in MECA for the first 48 hours, and then I was saying, no, you got to let me out, I won't do anything, and I was allowed to go back onto the open ward. I then was later discharged because my sister had gotten her P plates and I had this art thing I wanted to go to. So I was then discharged, and even though it was against medical advice or whatever, against mental health, I don't know, something like that, but I was so told I want to be discharged. I was then later diagnosed at Touchstone with borderline personality disorder, anorexia nervosa, binge purge subtype, OCD, PTSD, and an attachment disorder. So my then depression and anxiety was then just off my diagnosis list and put on from the borderline. I then became underweight yet again before I went to Bali and put on 2 kilos. I am now struggling a lot with my food intake, and it's gotten a lot worse since stopping Touchstone, as I had a huge attachment to Touchstone because there's the attachment disorder. I would be there every day, and if I couldn't make it one day, I would call. It was pretty bad, to be honest. But I then am now 11 months self-harm free. I haven't cut myself for almost a year now, which is really great because at one point in my life I was self-harming at any chance I had. But I have now made some new amazing friends, and I still have lots of my old friends who is lying right on my couch right now. And I moved schools to a care school to try and help a lot better because I didn't fit into a mainstream school. And I'm now halfway through my Cert 2 of general education. No, I have almost completed Cert 2 in general education in a year, like in a semester, which usually would take a whole year. But I am, as much as I am working through my issues at the moment, my eating, I guess you could say I'm not ready to give up it yet. And I can do a whole another story on any of my diagnoses if that's what you guys want to see. If you guys want any other sit down talks with like what I do, or with how my family and friends reacted to all this, I don't know, but just I guess you can comment it down in the comments. And I guess I'll see you guys next time. Bye.